Because if I don't move the flame back and forth quickly, one side of the joint will be cooling while the other side is heating up. Okay, so supposedly we have a bezel here that is the correct height and length for the stone that we've chosen, and we've put the ends together so that they're touching and well fitted and under compression, that is, they're pushing against each other a little bit so that they'll stay together while the heating is going on. And we're going to set it up in a pair of tweezers on the third hand, making sure that the tweezers are holding opposite the joint so that we don't draw heat with the tweezers from either side of the bezel. And making sure that the tweezers are holding only at the very tips, because if you push the bezel very far back into the tweezers where they're wider, they'll try to flatten out that part of the bezel and open up your joint. So it's held in just the very tips and opposite the joint. And now I'll cut a piece of solder for this joint, and it'll be a pretty generous piece of solder considering how small the joint is, because you actually want there to be a lump of solder in place when you're through with this bezel joint. I want there to be a lump of solder on this joint when I'm through this bezel joint, because some of that solder will inevitably be drawn into the backplate joint, and if you don't have a little bit of excess, then you'll end up with a crevice there. Now I'm going to dry that flux, and then I'm going to solder the joint. The way I'm going to do it, pretend this is the inner cone of the flame. The way I'm going to do it is to move the flame back and forth directly over the solder. I don't have to avoid heating the solder directly on this joint because the bezel is so thin that it will heat up at about the same rate that the solder does, so I don't need to avoid pre-melting the solder. What I do need to do is move back and forth very quickly, because if I don't move the flame back and forth quickly, one side of the joint will be cooling while the other side is heating up, and you won't get an even heat. So you have to move back and forth extremely rapidly and not go past the bezel like this, because it will cool off during that brief instant when the flame is not on it, and that will extend your heating time. So back and forth directly across the joint very quickly, but always on the bezel. And because this is such a light piece of metal and heats up so quickly, you won't be able to take the time to see different stages of the melt of the solder. Instead, what you'll have to do is look for the solder to dome, that is, to lose its crisp rectangular shape. And as soon as it does, it turns shiny and domes, then get off the joint. Alright, so I'm lighting the torch. I'll put a pretty small flame on it, of course. This is a number 2 tip on a Miko midget. And I need a neutral flame, but not a very big one. I'm going to dry the flux with the outer envelope of the flame so that solder doesn't jump around when I start heating it. And then I'm going to turn the light off so that I can see the red glow of the metal when it gets hot more easily. It'll give me a warning when it's approaching soldering temperature. So very quickly, that's it. That's the solder for the bezel joint. Take it out and pickle it and file the underside of the bezel to fit this back plate. Okay, I just want to make sure this has no fingerprint oils or tarnish on it, so that the solder will flow freely. Actually, so that the flux will flow freely, because that allows the solder to flow. So that back plate is ready. Bezel out of the pickle. Now, in a real stone setting, this is the stage where I would be sizing the bezel to the stone more carefully, making sure that the size of the bezel was absolutely correct, and then shaping the bezel to the stone so that the stone would drop into the bezel and the bezel will pick up off the stone without picking up the stone with it. That way I know that the stone fits in the bezel without having to flex the bezel into another shape, because as soon as I solder it to the back plate, it's going to lose all its flexibility. But in this case, for this demonstration of soldering, I'm just going to file the back, the underside of the bezel, as though I've already fitted it to the stone. And it's important to file it gently, starting with a backstroke, so that it doesn't catch on the file. If it catches on one of the file teeth, it can easily be distorted, so all that shaping that you've done will be wasted. And to make sure that I've got it filed all the way around. There, now it's filed all the way around. Now, I'll put fire coat on both pieces. Isn't really necessary for the bezel, but I do it anyway, since the bezel is fine silver. Fire coat is a solution of boric acid in denatured alcohol. And we burn it off, leaving the boric acid as a coating on the metal, which helps slow down the formation of fire scale on sterling silver. And then I'll flux the back plate. And the bezel will get its flux from there. Make sure that it's also thoroughly wet with flux. And then I'll cut solder for this. A few little pieces. I never know exactly how many pieces I'm going to put in. I know when it looks right, so I'll show you when I've got it the way I think it should be. Push the solder to the outside of the bezel. Okay, so in this case it took 5 pieces. And I'll let you have a look in there to see the arrangement. Now, to make sure that I don't have too much flux there, I'm going to dry the flux brush on my jeans and touch it to the joint so that it soaks up any excess flux that's flooding the joint. Because there doesn't need to be very much flux. As long as it's coating everything it should be coating. Okay, so then I'll dry the flux. I have to be careful doing this because if I dry it too fast, the boiling of the flux will kick the solder into the middle of the back plate where it can't reach the joint. So I have to dry it carefully. And when it starts to boil and sizzle, I can see the little pieces of solder moving a little bit. I need to slow down my heating even more so that I dry it very slowly. There we go. Okay, now it's dry. Okay, so I'm going to explain this heating process using my flux brush as a stand-in for the inner cone of the flame. So this is where the inner cone would be. The inner cone of the flame is this. Okay, here's the inner cone of the flame right here. And in a neutral flame, the tip of the inner cone is a little bit fuzzy, not very distinct, and the tip of the inner cone is the part of the flame that's the hottest. Okay, so pretend this is the inner cone of the flame. Now the problem with heating this joint is that the bezel heats up very quickly when the flame is on it and will tend to melt before the back plate is hot enough to accept the solder. So to correct that heatability problem, what I do with the bezel joint is I heat the back plate until the bezel is almost too hot, and then I pull the flame away for a moment and let the bezel cool, because the same property that makes it heat up really fast makes it cool really fast. So I heat up the back plate until the bezel is a little bit too hot, take the flame away, let the bezel cool, and bring it back to heat the back plate some more. So I'll heat the back plate in the middle and around the edges, wherever I can reach it. And as soon as the bezel gets too hot, then I'll pull the flame away and let the bezel cool for a second. Bring it back, heat the back plate some more. Bezel gets too hot, let it cool for a second. So I'm pulsing the flame on and off during this heat. And every time I see the bezel flare, that is, become bright with heat, I pull the flame away, but only long enough for that flare to die off. And each time I come back to reheat, the bezel will have cooled off and the back plate will be a little hotter than it was, until finally they're both at a rosy red temperature, and that's just below where the solder begins its melt. And as soon as I see them both at the same rosy red, then I keep the flame on there for a little while, let the solder dome, that is, turn shiny and soft looking in shape, and as soon as it domes, I'll turn the flame at a 45-degree angle and move it to the outside of the bezel to draw the solder as it flows out to the outside of the joint. Okay, so here we go. And put the flame right on the back plate. Keep it on there until the bezel glows. Take it off. Put it back on till the bezel glows bright. Take it off. Back on again. Off. On again. Off. On again. The back plate's brightening up. On and off like this until there's the solder flowing. Okay, so this is well soldered. I can still see solder ghosts on the inside. I can definitely see those. They're not expected to go away. With hard solder, the solder ghosts will not disappear. If you try to make them disappear, you'll overheat everything. The solder ghost is one of these little remnants right here of the original piece of solder. So it's got had 5 pieces of solder. It has 5 solder ghosts in there, and it should have them. If they were gone, it would be because I'd overheated it. And I have solder flowed throughout the entire outside of the seam. And that's the important thing about this joint. The solder has arrived at the outside of the bezel all the way around. There are no gaps. And the bezel joint, as you can see, is a little bit less full than it was before I soldered this to the back plate. But it will have enough solder in it, since I had an excess, to clean it up and make it smooth and make it disappear. Okay, at this point your stone should fit in the bezel. It'll be a tight fit and it'll have to be pulled out, usually with a piece of beeswax that you rub onto the stone to get it stuck, and yank it out with a jerk and pull the stone back out. It's at this stage that you would remove whatever you don't want of the back plate, so that you can incorporate this setting into whatever piece of jewelry you're making. And later you'll worry about the height of the top of the bezel and tapering it and all that. We'll go into that in other videos, hopefully.